Good morning and welcome once again. It's a pleasure to be back with you today, and I trust that your week is progressing just as God had intended it to. Even in our disobedience or willfulness, God has a way of kind of bringing things around to bring us into conformity to His will. And so at the end of every day, I may not be pleased with how I dealt with the day before, that day, but I am thankful that God has a way of redeeming everything and for the good, and that's why I love to call him my Redeemer. I think it's my favorite title for God. You may also be noticing I'm still wearing the In-N-Out Burger shirt, not because I haven't taken it off since yesterday, but the truth is sometimes I do more in these in one day, just simply because I don't have a time to finish my first thought in my first session, so I go ahead and start a second session and it comes the next day. But yesterday I began talking about my devotional time in First Chronicles, the first 9 chapters, which are considered by most people as being the longest, most boring section of the entire Bible because of the lengthy genealogy. And I talked about why I see such value in it. And the first thing I pointed out was the fact that God has made us all the same. We're all of the same brotherhood. Mankind is all directly descended from the same persons. That's Adam and Eve. And therefore we have equality, just as our founding fathers wrote in the Declaration of Independence that God created all men equal. That was a radical statement in 1776. I mean, not that other people didn't believe that, but certainly the people who are in positions of power didn't believe that. Especially in Europe, you had what was called the right of kings, that if you were the king, you were there by God's will, and it was basically a manipulation of Paul's teaching on submission to governmental authority, and what they believed is they were right whether they were wrong or right, because simply they were ordained by God to be the king, and anybody who tried to remove them from that position was going against God. That's why the founding fathers, when they signed this declaration and really initiated the beginning of the American Revolution, were doing something that quite literally had never been tried before. There was no precedent in human history. We could try to point to the Greeks and say they had the first democracy, but in fact it was a very limited democracy, and it was much more like our own republic. But I don't want to get into a civics or a history class with you. But I want to move on to the second thing that really stuck out to me. And that's as we looked at the genealogical line that's laid out, it's really the line that leads us to Jesus. I mean, he starts with Adam, then he goes on to Abraham and the children of Israel, but then he focuses upon particularly the house of Judah and David, who came from the house of Judah. And we all understand, hopefully, if you have read Matthew's gospel, Matthew does the same thing in a very abbreviated way, but he brings us to the fact that Jesus was a direct descendant of King David. And that was significant. That was important because the Messiah was also described as being a son of David, a direct descendant. That's how he could become King of Kings and Lord of Lords, that he would sit on the kingdom of Israel, which would become the kingdom of the world. In the end of human history, would become the kingdom of our God. And so without this historical record, we wouldn't be able to make those connections. Which brings me really to the third thing, and that's the fact that it's a historical connection. Many people, again, don't recognize this, but what the genealogies do is establish what we call the historicity of the Bible and this portion of the Scriptures. In other words, it's a historical document, not simply something that's a mythology created. The ancient world had a lot of mythologies, and we know many of us are familiar with the Greek mythologies, but even before them, whether we're talking about the ancient Sumerians or the Babylonians and these other cultures, they all had mythologies, and they had basically origin stories of where they came from. But if you read them, you realize that they read very differently from the biblical account. The biblical account is written as a historical narrative. It's not trying to create some out of this world or abstract story. It's telling us about real people living in real time, dealing with real problems and reacting to them in real ways, which is not what happens, I think, is in the modern spinning of myths that we have today, the kind of the superhero epics that are making such a big headline in the theaters today and so many people are excited about. The reality is we watch those and we realize these aren't real people. At least the people they're portraying aren't real people, because real people couldn't do the kind of things that they do. Although there are some whack jobs who think they can, but that's a whole other issue. But the simple fact is that The Bible establishes its historical record by writing about events in a historically accurate way. This is why the first archaeologists, which is a science that's less than 200 years old, when they first started doing the work of looking for archaeological sites, it was biblical sites they were looking for, and guess what they were using? They were using the Bible. They used the Bible to guide them to where they could find those locations. And so even in Greek mythology, when it talks about the city of Troy, do you know that Paul visited the city of Troy? It was called Troas in his day, and it was there that he received a call from God to go to Europe, to Philippi, and begin the first European outreach of the gospel, and that spread through Greece, spread through Rome, spread through Spain, and on up all the way into England and throughout the rest of the European continent, and eventually came to America with our founding fathers. So it's interesting when you begin to study the geography, the history, and how these things all tie together. And it becomes really confirming to you that we're reading a book of history. We're not reading a book that just is telling us stories about something that somebody made up. In fact, I would just simply say that that gives us such a firm foundation for the rest of the scriptures that we become really kind of informed people. Informed about not only the history of mankind, but informed about the will of God and the purpose of God. So, again, those of you who are going to say to me right now, okay, I get it. Next time I get to First Chronicles, I'll start reading all those genealogies. I would just like to say to you that when I first started reading it, I felt the same way you did. I thought, what the heck and who and why and how do you even say these people's names and these main names mean anything? That comes over time, which may be one of the last points I probably ought to wrap up with, Dave, before I move on, is that I think a lot of us have this idea that we've done it and that's it. We've read it and we don't need to do any more. I encountered people from time to time. We'll have this conversation. I said, well, have you ever read the Bible? And they say, well, yeah, I read the Bible. And when I began to press them about what they have read, I found that I've never met a single one who said they read the Bible who actually read the Bible. That is from Genesis to Revelation. But secondly, I find that they've read a piece here and read a piece there, usually disjointing things like Genesis and Ecclesiastes, and they decide from that snapshot that there's nothing there. We all know that today, because of the power of the periscope and the microscope, the microscope and the telescope, that we can discover a lot of things that lie outside of our initial observance. And the same thing is true with the Bible. When we look at the big picture of the Bible, which is why I say read it from Genesis to Revelation, it gives us a totally different view of the Bible than if we just read pieces and parts, because we begin to realize it's a connected book when you read it from beginning to end like you would any other book. But secondly, when you look at it with a microscope, you really begin to look very, very closely into the text and examine things. You also see that there is just a clear evidence that these were people who were writing histories. They were recording what they saw. And not just simply what they believed, but they recorded what they saw. And these were real events in human history. So anyway, here again, I find myself, I'm out of time again. I'll try to pick this up on the other side. And yeah, I'll be wearing the same shirt. I'm sorry. Again, I guarantee you, I do not wear the same shirt every day, except when you're not watching. So anyway, God bless you and go in His grace.